Welcome to Mr. Ling's Guide to Variables. Let's dig in. So whenever we design an experiment to test a hypothesis, but we need to know our variables. We need to know all the things in an experiment that can change. So what are variables? That's just what they are, things that can change, right? They're the things that can change in any situation, including scientific experiments. So look at your window right now. Is it day or night? Guess what? Daylight, or the amount of daylight, is a variable. It changes hour by hour or even minute by minute. And another question for you, what's the weather like right now? Well, there's lots of variables with weather. There's things like temperature. There's things like cloud cover. There's things like rain or snow. There's things like humidity. Those are all variables. So you have variables all around you. So in an experiment, we need to think about these things. We need to think about all the variables, all the things that can affect the outcome of our experiment. And when we do science, we need to isolate the one variable that we're investigating, okay? And we want to see how that one variable, how changing that one variable is going to affect the outcome of whatever we're measuring here. So what do I mean by isolate? So isolate is basically just to keep by itself, really. And it just makes sure, it's just basically making sure that we keep that one variable as the only thing that we change in an experiment. If we don't isolate our variable, then we won't know what's causing any differences in our outcomes. All right, so I've got a little experiment here. And let's say we're interested to know, how does the amount of sunlight affect the growth rate of plants? So here we're interested in the amount of sunlight, right, as the variable that we're testing. So we're going to change that. We're going to change the amount of sunlight these plants get. We'll measure the growth rate of the plants to see the outcome of that. Okay, so growth rate, we could just maybe let these plants grow over a 6-week period and maybe measure them once a week and kind of calculate the growth rate over that time. So when we set this experiment up, we might have 3 or 4 groups of plants here. One group would receive full sun all day long. Another group might receive sunlight for about 6 hours a day or so. And then maybe another group here that receives 0 sunlight. And if we have more groups, they'd be somewhere in between, different amounts of sunlight per group. So in this case, what would your hypothesis be? Well, here is my hypothesis. If I change the amount of sunlight that the plants receive, then the plants receiving the longest duration of sunlight will grow the fastest. I think that sounds pretty good. What do you think? All right. Well, now let's think about this for a second. What if we give some of these plants more water than others? What if some of the plants maybe came with different soil, or we use different types of soil for the different pots of plants we're using here? Or maybe what if we even use different plants altogether? What if some of these plants are pea plants and other ones are tomato plants, right? So these are all variables. These are all other things that can change the outcome of our experiment. Okay, so we have to think about all those things. All right, well, now that we've kind of thought about this experiment a little bit, let's put some names to these variables. And this would be your vocabulary for this mini lesson here. So first of all, our independent variable. This is our test variable. This is the thing we're testing. This is the thing that we're changing to see what happens, right? It's also known as the test variable or the manipulated variable. Then we have the dependent variable. This is the thing that we're measuring in the experiment. Changes in this depend on the independent variable, right? So that's why we call it the dependent variable. Makes sense, right? It's also called the outcome variable or the responding variable. Lastly, we have the controlled variables. And the controlled variables are just basically all the things we have to keep the same in order to isolate our independent variable, okay? Now, sometimes experiments will have a control group, but that's not the same thing as controlled variables. Okay, so let's go back to our experiment here and let's label some of these things that we've talked about. So our independent variable, this is our testing variable. This is the thing that we're testing what we're interested in. And again, we're wondering, how does the amount of sunlight affect the growth rate of plants? So amount of sunlight is our independent variable. That's what we're changing. Our dependent variable is our growth rate of plants. That's what we're measuring. And that is going to depend on the amount of sunlight that they get. Hopefully, we always hope to get a change or hope to get differences in our data so that we can show there's a connection between those changes and that change in the independent variable. And then all these things I had on the right before, guess what? Yes, those are the controlled variables. These are all the things we have to keep the same. All these things we have to consider, even the type of container that we use. You might think of other ones too. These are just what I thought of. All right, so remember, if you don't isolate your variable, if you don't isolate the thing that you're testing, the thing you have the question about, then you won't know what caused the changes in your results. If those controlled variables aren't controlled and kept the same, we won't know if any changes in those growth rates were due to the sunlight or were due to other things like the soil or the water or whatever. Also, if you have a well-written hypothesis, it will automatically include your variables. So let's take a look at our hypothesis again. And again, our same hypothesis as before. If I change the amount of sunlight that the plants receive, then the plants receiving the longest duration of sunlight will grow the fastest. There's our independent variable right there, the amount of sunlight. And there's our dependent variable, the growth rate. So there you have it. Okay, well, thanks for watching. If you have any questions about this stuff, you can always email me at jling@mewebacademy.org, or since this is on YouTube, you can post a comment on the video and I'll respond. Also, remember to like and subscribe. There probably will be more videos coming.